Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group of the Hannah Arendt Center. Today we continue to read Hannah Arendt's book on violence, or her essay, depending on which edition you're using. As I said last session, this is, in my view, one of the most relevant and important and provocative of Arendt's essays in our time. And it's, I think, going to be worth spending the two sessions on, last session and then this session. We talked last week about the first two parts of the essay. And I told you that I sort of, in my own ways of thinking about it, call the first part violence and its instruments, in the sense that it's about why violence is returning today, or in the time she's writing it, in the late 1960s, and also that the importance of the instrumental aspect of violence. The second part is about power and violence, in the conceptual sense, and she separates power as this acting collectively, this group action, and that power comes from people acting in concert, whereas violence comes from the means of violence through implements. This third part, which in my view is the most important and to me one of the most interesting of all of Arendt's texts, we could call the nature and causes of violence. That's how she begins it. So on page 156 of the edition in this book, The Crisis of the Republic, she says, to speak about the nature and causes of violence in these terms must appear presumptuous at a moment. And then she goes on to say, when foundation money and scientific work is beginning to study violence through social science and even natural science. So what is this third part about? It is about the attractions of violence, what makes violence attractive, and then it is about the dangers of violence, why violence will not succeed in doing what its advocates and adherents want it to be able to succeed in doing. And what is it that its advocates and adherents want it to be able to succeed in doing? To provide a new experience of freedom in the world. So the argument in a nutshell that Arendt is going to make is that violence is attractive for a whole host of reasons, and that violence is human, and that we can't just sit there and say violence is bad, because violence has many uses, and often violence is rational, and violence is deeply human, she wants to argue. And one of the main reasons, and she says probably the main reason, that violence is so attractive today, again, late 20th century, but I think we could apply it to our time and the early 21st century as well, is because with the rise of big, centralized, bureaucratic, administrative government, there is a sense of powerlessness and what she calls Praxisentzug, the withdrawal of action, a feeling of impotence that attacks us, and that violence is held out by many people as the way to return ourselves to power. This, of course, brings us back to her distinction between power and violence. And what she says is that wherever power reigns, violence retreats, and vice versa. If ever violence becomes our means of taking control, power is destroyed. And so to the extent we turn to violence as a way of reclaiming freedom and action and our human agency, we increasingly destroy power. That's going to be her argument. Just a reminder to mute your mics if you're not speaking so we don't get feedback, because I'm hearing a little bit. To run you through a little bit of the argument, again, somebody's mic is not muted and I'm hearing a lot of noise. So if your mic is not muted, please do mute your mic.
David Bell and Judy Berkowitz.
All right. Judy Berkowitz and David Dell, will you please mute your mics? See what we can do. Is there a way to
Berkowitz.
Judy? That's my mother, unfortunately.
I did. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. So you obviously haven't muted your mic. You gotta mute your mic.
Can you hear me, Roger?
Yes.
Roger, it's Sam. Whoever the admin is on this call, if it's you or if it's somebody else,
it's not me. I can't do it.
They can do it.
It's probably Greg, who's probably not on the call. What is that?
I'll send Craig a text.
Okay. Please try and stop the noises so we can continue. Judy Berkowitz, please just hang up if you can for a little while.
David Bell.
Or David Bell. What is that noise? Who is... All right. I'm sorry. Never had this happen.
That is David Bell repeatedly.
No, but Roger, you can mute everyone. I mean, why don't you guys just mute everyone, and then it's not up to any individual to mute themselves.
I can't right now because I'm not the administrator of the call. Excuse me.
There have been problems with Zoom. This isn't Zoom, but people deliberately trying to sabotage meetings.
Yeah, I think I don't know if that's what's going on or not, but all right, we should get this fixed in a second. I'm hoping Craig Rothstein's going to get on and fix it, he says. Just bear with me 1 minute. We're going to fix this in a second. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
and he's gone.
Okay. I'm glad we got that fixed. Sorry about that. To run you through the argument of the essay, she begins with what I would call, or this part 3 of the essay. We begin with an introduction in which she argues against the scientific approach to the question of violence. It's fairly obvious that animals commit violence as well. And so a number of scientists say, oh, man is just like an animal. She turns it around and says, well, it's just as easy to say that animals are like men, that violence is actually deeply human, not that it's animal. and that the reason that we do our experiments on animals is not because violence is an animal-like trait, but simply because men can cheat. Namely, men have freedom; they can act differently, and they're hard to study in that way. And so it's an interesting reversal on her point. We can talk more about it if you'd like. She then goes on to say, one of the things these scientists say is that animals are aggressive and man is aggressive by nature, but that man no longer needs his aggression because he's set up rational, civilized society, and so that aggression is repressed. And it is scientists, experts that teach us to manipulate and control our instincts, teach us to be rational. And if man refuses, he is a beast and more beastly than other animals. And so she says that science sets itself up as this attempt to regulate the violence of man. What she wants to argue, though, is that it is human to be violent, and that violence is very much part of man's human nature, but also his humanity. And then she offers 4 or 5 what we might call attractions of violence. Reasons that violence is actually important to being human. The first one is that violence is often the only meaningful response to injustice. If an injustice happens, if you're struck by, or if there's an injustice in the world, violence and rage are the first and often the most meaningful responses to that. And the example she offers is Billy Budd. For those of you who don't know the story, Billy Budd is an innocent who's accused unjustly of a crime, and he reaches out and punches with the divine judgment of God the person who unjustly accused him and kills him. Billy Budd has a stutter, and the result is justice is done through an act. And she says sometimes violence is needed to respond to injustices. The problem is that more often than not, what we respond to is not the injustice itself, but hypocrisy. And hypocrisy, she says, is what actually leads us to be enraged, not the injustice. And then we seek to unmask the hypocrite. We seek to show that this person who claims to be good and claims to be seeking to do justice is really a hypocrite, someone who needs to be exposed. And while that can be in the name of justice, and it can be rational to want to expose hypocrites, those who in a sense clothe their own interests and power in the guise of doing good and justice, the to rationalize and generalize the hatred of hypocrisy means that you hunt for the ulterior motives of everybody, and this leads to terror because nobody is pure, and since nobody is pure, the hunt to unmask the hypocrite will lead to an incredible unmasking and violence against everyone, including yourself. A second attraction of violence is collective violence. The idea of the band of brothers fighting together in a war or for a cause or in a rebellion. And collective violence, she says, misleads many good people into the hope that a new community will be founded through the sort of blood bond or the bond of violence. But this hope, she thinks, is an illusion, and it will not lead to the birth of a new man. And here she opposes people like Frantz Fanon and Sorel, who often argue that there's a kind of new birth that violence can give to, a new kind of freedom. A third kind of attraction of violence connected to this is a hatred of the bourgeoisie and the system and the establishment. So here she's mainly talking again about Fanon and Sorel, but also Pareto. And the argument here is that the system, the bourgeoisie, has become a kind of comfortable elite that, provides us with food and housing and healthcare, etc., but dehumanizes us in the sense that we become a little bit like animals to be taken care of, chickens and rats, as she'll later say. And much of the violence, the theorization of violence, the attraction of violence in the 60s and 70s, she says, is intellectually driven against the system, against specifically the group of people who run the system, which she calls a new mandarins, using the text of Noam Chomsky, a kind of new intellectual and scientific and expert elite that becomes the new managerial elite. And I highly recommend that you take the time to read Appendix 16, which is the footnote that she drops here on page 169 when she's discussing this. And in that footnote, she discusses Noam Chomsky again, and she says a number of things that are fairly shocking. She says that these new mandarins, these new intellectuals, the meritocrats who run government, are willing to serve every government in power, no matter which government, and that they're actually less meritocrats and more social climbers. And that she then quotes Chomsky in saying that there's no reason to think that those with knowledge and technique, namely us, but those of us in government, those educated elites, will be benign in their exercise of power, or more benign than those who claim power on the basis of wealth or aristocratic origin. What she's saying here is that the elites who run government have interests, just like any other aristocratic or monarchical or oligarchic elite. And when they run government, they will not run it in the interests of the general interest, whatever that is. They will run it in their interests. And then she then goes on to say that the elites in government who run government in their interests will create a resentment against meritocracy that she says will be as dangerous and as violent as resentments of earlier groups of oppressed peoples who at least could say that their oppression was no fault of their own. The point is now that what the elites basically say is we're the smart ones, we're the educated ones, and we're going to run it, and you all are the dumb ones, the deplorables, whatever word you want to use, and you have to suffer. And so she says that this will lead to violence, collective violence against the intellectual elite in the form of a racial antagonism. And she says it's going to be racial, not class-based, because she doesn't think the elites form a class more than they form like a race. They're the intelligent people. And this will lead, she says, this is her words, not mine, to a danger of demagogues and popular leaders who will organize against the elites. And the result will be that the meritocratic elites will be forced to institute tyrannies and despotism to keep their power. These pages on the intellectual attractions, the attractions of violence against an intellectual meritocratic elite, to me, are some of the most relevant passages in all of Arendt's work if you want to understand what's going on in the world today. And we can talk about that. Another attraction of violence that she considers on page 171 to 173 is the attraction of violence in the name of life and the biological imperative for violence. Violence justified as a form of power and creativity, which she says is often going to be connected to racism. Race as an ideology, the violent logic of racism. And so this is another form of violence that she thinks will emerge. She then has a break in the text, and here we sort of come to her final conclusion, which is she asks, is violence rational? And her answer is yes. Violence is rational when it achieves its ends. And it can achieve its ends usually only in the short term. We went through this last week. It can't achieve long-term ends because the world is too unpredictable. And once you unleash violence, it tends to create unpredictable effects. But it can also dramatize grievances about injustice. It can ensure the hearings for moderation and injustice. So she says violence can pay. It can work, but it pays indiscriminately. And the most probable change is to produce a more violent world. And then she gets to what I consider to be the main point of this essay, which is that the greater the bureaucratization of public life, the greater will be the attraction of violence. Bureaucracy, she says, leads to bigness of government, leads to administration, leads to the power of anonymous government bureaucrats and administrators. And what it does is it sucks dry the power of the people to act. It sucks dry the power of the people to act and begin new ideas and new politics. And so she'll say, action has suffered more from the modern age desire for progress than any other human faculty. The demand for progress and growth, for bigger and bigger governments, for more government administration, for more government services, leads to administration and bureaucracy and what she calls the rule of nobody. And so on page 180, she will say, the great danger today is that man is turned into a chicken or a rat, ruled over by an elite that derives its power from the wise counsels of intellectual aides who actually believe that men in think tanks are thinkers and that computers can think. The result of this, she says, is that what we need today are new examples of freedom. And that this example, she says, is often offered by people who counsel violence. Violence as a way to prove our freedom against the system, against the elite, against those impenetrable obstacles like bigness and that prevent human action. But she says, while riots and rebellions, quote, make people feel they are acting together in ways that they rarely can, she doesn't actually think it will result in the creation of new institutions of freedom for the very reasons I've said, which is that violence tends to not be controllable. Once you start it, it leads just to more violence. It doesn't lead to some end. And so this is largely how she ends the essay. Every decrease in power, she says, insofar as we create big administrative, bureaucratic, institutional, centralized governments, every decrease in power is an open invitation to violence, if only because those who hold power and feel it slipping from their hands, be they the government or be they the governed, have always found it difficult to resist the temptation to substitute violence for it. And so this is the end of the essay, and her argument really is that the reason violence is so alive today, the reason the justifications, the glorifications, and the desire for violence is so alive today is a reaction to the large governmental centralization of power in a way that has decreased power both for the government and the governed, in ways that lead us to seek power, seek freedom, seek action in any way we can, including through violence. All right, so I'll stop there and open us up to questions. If you do want to ask a question, now you can unmute your mic and ask away. Feel free to jump in. I know there's also questions in the chat, and I will take a look at them. So Nancy Felsen asks, my question about Anthony Giddens' notion of dialectical relation between structure and agency led me to think more about whether Hannah Arendt's notion of system and action tries to get at the same dynamic. Okay, well, she gives you a cite to Giddens' lecture there. I don't have a good sense of Giddens, so I'm not going to be able to answer that now. I do think that this dialectical relation between structure and agency, Arendt is not a dialectical thinker in that sense, so she's not going to put it in those terms. But she is going to say that, look, in the modern age, we have sought progress. And in seeking progress, we have demanded bigger, better government. And in doing so, we have atrophied our capacity to be free and to act. Is there a solution to that? She offers some in small tidbits here and there through her work, but she's more of an analyst here than offering a solution. How do we respond to this problem? Well, her account here is not through violence, although that's what we've generally, that's been our response. Are there other ways to preserve the idea and practice of freedom and action in the modern world? Clearly, yes, at times there are ways that people act and those actions matter. But Arendt is concerned that there are ever fewer ways and opportunities for that. And that's what motivates much of her work.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Oh.
Is that Tara?
Yeah. I guess I'm sort of echoing, Richard had a question here. About the bureaucratic elites and, the kind of Trump reaction against sort of technocrats in the United States. And, I've read this essay a few times, and this time around I felt this real sort of dissonance with the essay in that in certain ways she analyzes this, what has really happened in a way, but then she also seems to have somewhat conservative responses. So one might say that one of the answers would be like smaller government, right? Which then feeds into a kind of, conservative line. But then also she has this moment where she talks about collective guilt and that the kind of collective white guilt of the 60s and how if everyone and it reminds me now of a kind of the political correctness that we live under for many good reasons, but that if everyone is guilty, it's sort of like the same thing with hypocrisy, then nobody is. And
Yeah.
some of this just felt very like, I think last class someone had said something about like her reference to kind of race issues feels really problematic in our contemporary lens. On the other hand, there is something to it that almost feels like we can't even think it now because it is politically incorrect.
So those are good points. So first of all, let me say Hannah Arendt never thought of herself as a liberal or a conservative. She didn't think in those terms. So accusing her, I'm not saying you're doing this, but saying she's a conservative or she's a liberal is not going to be helpful to us.
Right. I
think the effort is to try and understand what she's saying, which is always provocative, which doesn't mean you have to agree with it. So on page 181 in the text I'm using, which is the in Crises of the Republic, which is where she's been talking about the problems of big government and anonymous administration. The bottom of the page, she'll at the top of the page, she'll say something along the lines that Tara said, which is that if a new example of freedom will have a chance, if at all, it's likely only in a small country or in small, well-defined sectors in the mass societies of large powers. Right. So now remember that she wrote a book called On Revolution, in which She argues that the sort of core constitutional innovation of the United States of America was federalism, and the idea that in the United States there was no sovereignty and there was no central administration, and that government took place not only amongst the states but even among counties and towns and town hall meetings and things like that. And to her, that was the reason that she could say that the U.S. Constitution was a constitution of freedom, based in the experience of freedom, and that provided for freedom. She thinks that has disappeared. So, you know, I have long argued that federalism is not a conservative or a liberal idea. It's become a conservative idea since the 1960s and 70s, to the extent that centralization often took place at the behest of a liberal court. But there are many leftists in the United States who argue for what they call a new federalism, especially in times in which the Supreme Court has now become conservative, in which federalism would become very much of a liberal or leftist idea. Federalism itself, I don't think, is conservative or liberal. In Hannah Arendt's analysis, federalism is essential in a large country to protect against the centralization of power, and thus to preserve the idea of freedom in a society. So, you know, that's not conservative or liberal. It's an analysis of the importance of federalism in a free society. On the bottom of 181, she says something that I think is quite relevant to your comment, Tara, about the right wing or not. She says, moreover, there is the recent rise of a curious new brand of nationalism, usually understood as a swing to the right, but more probably an indication of a growing worldwide resentment against bigness as such. While national feelings formerly tended to unite various ethnic groups by focusing their political sentiments on the nation as a whole, we now watch how an ethnic nationalism begins to threaten with dissolution the oldest and best established nation states. Now she's talking to some degree about, you know, the Welsh and the Scots in the United Kingdom and the Catalonians in Spain and other places. But I think the analysis fits with what we're going through today quite well. Much of what lies behind the populist nationalisms that we are witnessing around the world today is, I think, not issue specific, not about immigration or education or abortion or whatever the issues are, but is a sense that an untouchable high elite has taken it upon themselves to run the world, and that people feel disempowered. That's the analysis Arendt is making. And what she says is, in the face of the bigness and this resentment against bigness, there will be a resentment against intellectuals, a resentment against the elite, and there will be a call for action in the form of violence, often. And because violence makes people feel alive and makes people feel powerful. And I think that analysis of what we're going on. So when Richard in the comment that Richard Kaufman in the comment that Tara was talking about says, doesn't her argument about the bureaucratic elites play into Trump's arguments about the deep state? Well, yes, but I would also argue as it plays into Bernie's arguments about the state and the establishment. I don't think this is a partisan, one-sided argument. I think both sides feel very much as if they have been disempowered and not listened to by a kind of elite party bureaucratic mechanisms. Trump succeeded in destroying the Republican Party and taking it over. Bernie did not succeed in destroying the Democratic Party. You can agree or disagree with whether they should or not, but that's what's happened.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
Along those lines. I'm Klaus. Hi, calling in
Hi.
from Berlin, Germany. This is my first time here. It's a pleasure to join. I just was fortunate enough to see the first part just earlier today. I just had a question around this question of big government, small government, federalism, and so on, because I'd always understood, being from Denmark, we have big government like you can't believe compared to what it is you have in America, and I always saw her comments at a more fundamental level when reading The Human Condition, for instance, that she talks. Is it unclear what I'm saying?
No, you were interrupted.
Go ahead. You're fine.
Oh, sorry. That rather she talks about, for instance, this rise of the modern understanding of private property, which is actually not private at all. That's on page 70 in The Human Condition, just for reference. And it seems to me that it's not so much what one government does or doesn't do, but rather that and here we can call it structural, as someone mentioned with reference to Gittins, but there are some core features of the modern society that actually seem to preclude us from being spontaneous or acting, and that rather than a government setup that can do that, then the fundamental understandings of labor being the central part of what it is that we concern ourselves with, and that in a way the world is for sale in this modern understanding of private property, that we actually lose both our place in the world, but also the freedom to go beyond just looking after our biological necessities.
Okay.
So my comment is, yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah.
So there's sort of a lot that I'm trying to process in that question. Certainly the claim about life and the victory of what she'll call in The Human Condition anima laborans, the bare life, what Agamben will later call bare life. This idea that as governments get bigger and as administration gets bigger, which she doesn't really talk so much about in The Human Condition, but as we increasingly demand that our life needs be given precedence, we put those needs above other needs, like the need to create art or stories or institutions that bind us in a common world, which she calls the idea of work, the faculty of work, or action, the ability to begin things anew and create through our actions, do things that will lead to immortal worlds, governments, practices, institutions, etc. And so insofar as we focus on life, and most of us today, sheltering in place, focused on life and letting other institutions, in a sense, atrophy at the moment, very much so, we sort of deprive ourselves, or we set a lower value on action, and we'd rather keep ourselves alive. I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying, Klaus, but that, I think, fits with what she's saying here in the essay on violence. Do you want to just follow up quickly and tell me if I got the essence of what you were trying to say?
Sure. And it was, and I think my comment was just related to when someone wants to object, let's say, violently to what is going, the feeling of feeling powerless. And then I think the inescapability of the structures of the modern world that she sort of lays out at length in The Human Condition seems very much to be sort of structural moments that we maybe can't overcome or are so defining for what it is that we do. things like currency, things like that we have to go to work and so on. And it was just to say that sometimes maybe that violent objection, and there I would like to hear what it is that she offers as maybe alternatives to that, because as you're saying, she's sort of speaking for or in favor of something else. But if those structures are so fundamental, I mean, I don't think there's a piece of land on Earth that isn't somehow claimed or doesn't somehow belongs to someone in some general sense.
So
and
let me
that wasn't always the case. Yeah.
Let me see if I can offer some answer to your question of, well, then what? So Arendt is a political thinker. She's not an activist herself. She doesn't, there are times in her life when she did act and engage in politics, but they're, I think, the exception rather than the rule. If you ask her what should we be doing, she has hints in her work. She never really says that. That's not her thing. One place is in the essay at the end of this book, the interview, which I suggested that you might read as well, Thoughts on Politics and Revolution, where she speaks about the loss of power and authority by all great powers, which she says is clearly visible today, has led to an immense accumulation of the means of violence in the hands of government. But she says the increase in weapons cannot compensate for the loss of power. And she says one prerequisite for a revolution. So the answer to your question, Klaus, is for her revolution. She thinks the world needs a revolution of some sort. But what she says next is that at the moment, the one prerequisite for a coming revolution is lacking, a group of real revolutionaries. Just what the students on the left would most like to be, revolutionaries, that is what they are not. And she goes on to say that what a revolutionary is not someone who makes a revolution through violence or etc., but someone who knows when power is lying in the street, they know how to pick it up. And to do that, she says, what you need is what would pave the way for a revolution is a real analysis of the existing situation, not what she calls the theoretical sterility and analytical dullness of revolutionaries in the 60s. And, what does she actually mean by this? I think she means what she does in her writing. I think she means that in order to bring about a revolution, you actually have to understand our situation. You have to understand what's really going on. And that means understanding why there's a desire for violence, why power has disintegrated. And that means you have to speak in such a way and act in such a way that you provide a meaningful answer. And so her critique of most leftists and I would say rightist revolutionaries today is that they don't understand the real problem and they don't provide solutions that can address the problems and thus that will speak to people in ways that when the so-called revolutionaries speak and act, other people respond in ways that say, yes, that makes sense, and gather around them and create power. I will say that whether you agree with him or not, obviously people like President Trump and Viktor Orban have succeeded in creating power. Whether you agree with them or not, they're not using violence to get what they do done. They have spoken to, in Trump's case, because I know that case better, somewhere between 35 and 40%, 5% of the American people. Now, I will tell you, I don't think most of those people actually support Trump. What they do is they support him breaking apart a system that they see him as a cudgel to break apart. I don't know how many, but some of them do. But no one on the left, certainly not Bernie Sanders and certainly not Elizabeth Warren, and I don't think Joseph Biden either, but no one has provided on the left an attack on the power structure or the establishment that has inspired nearly the kind of interest and excitement that Donald Trump has inspired on the right. That's a failing of leadership, as far as I understand it, on the left. That they haven't done the kind of analysis. And part of that is that part of that analysis, if you believe Hannah Arendt, is to understand the threat of the system, the intellectual, expert-driven elite system that needs to be broken apart.
Roger,
Yeah.
can I jump in here for a second?
Okay.
I'd like to speak. Hello. There's several people trying to speak at one time. So
We'll go with Jack first, and then we'll let we'll go in we'll let a couple speak.
It was me after. Yeah.
Thank you, Roger. So first of all, I want to say that obviously she is writing this and speaking to the young revolutionaries of the day, 69 and 70 and thereabouts, when the revolutionary youth movement, so-called, told us that you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. They were relying on the belief that Marxism, which was the overriding philosophy or theory that was driving them, had a moral basis, and that it was that moral basis that if only people got awakened by a little bit of violence, people would just join with them because of the morality that they were projecting. And they used Sorel and Fanon as examples because that they had just lived through the liberation of the colonies in Africa through a Fanonist belief, and what was happening in Vietnam, which started with little terrorist acts in Saigon and it ended up in a full-blown war where they could see that the revolutionaries had developed support. Now that I'm not trying to say that they were right and I think her critique was proved to be totally correct, but we have to remember that they didn't have Hannah Arendt to look back to, as we do. and really, seriously, what they looked back on, what they looked to was the Marxist writings of the day, people who were trying to break free from Stalinism, but who wanted to get back to Marx and Lenin in a way that seemed to them real. So if you put it in terms, so it's very clear that she is really prescient in her analysis here, and if you look to today, your example of the difference between Trump and Sanders, I see it. I just want to say that I see it as a correct vision of the difference between them, with the exception that I believe that Trump is more successful only because he appeals to the racist part of American culture, which is something that Sanders does not, and that's really the basis of his strength. And if he did not do that, then he and Sanders would be on a par. It's that this attack on the elite that he has led has this racist component that really brings forward a buried or an unaddressed racism in the culture.
Thanks. I think that's well said, Jack. Who else? Someone else had wanted to speak? I want to let a couple.
It was me
first.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Who's this?
It's David. It's David Bell. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
I hear you fine, David. Go ahead.
Okay. There's a lot that I'm stimulated to say, but I'll try and keep it fairly brief. I think for me, there's something, first of all, that needs to be distinguished. I mentioned it last time. There is what I call overt violence. That's a violent act, be it hitting someone, revolution, and so on. But there are also structures of violence that are constituted by the political, cultural, and social formations in which we live. They're not overtly violent. I'm talking about the violence of poverty. I'm talking about the violence of having no medical care. I'm talking about the violence of living in a pandemic where you're crowded in a house with 6 people and have no health care. So I think there's a kind of turning a blind eye when we only focus on overt forms of violence And I think in some way that's linked to my problem about big and small government. I think big government, if one's talking about bureaucratic layers of government, which are instruments of power for an elite that acts behind the scenes, I can understand that. But to say big government is bad, to me, is a bit childish. Because big government is there. Big government is facilitating capital. Big government is facilitating the way we live in all sorts of quiet ways. But when we talk about big government in terms of looking after healthcare, looking after housing, looking after education, providing people with the minimum that they can have a decent human life, that can only be carried out by big government. It can be carried out by big government that has a proper, popular, democratic character, if you like, a federalized character. But it still has to be, in a sense, big government. So I don't know how we can be talking about living in the wealthiest countries in the world, surrounded by such poverty, and seeing the way forward is we mustn't have big government. We will need big government to undo the violence that's quotidian.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, I agree with much of what you said, I believe. Neither Arendt nor I are against, I mean, it depends what you mean by big government. Certainly not against government power and government size. She thought that I'm hearing someone say.
I entered on my computer because I was out working in my kitchen. I'm making a ragu from scratch.
Okay. The per point is simply that is less about bigness, although bigness relates to it, and more to centralization. Now, this may not be an important distinction. Whether on the question of the violence of poverty, which I think is an important point. I'm going to just speak for I'm going to try and understand Arendt's view on this right now, which is that she will make in the book On Revolution, she will make a distinction between poverty and misery. And misery is a kind of life in which one is so overrun with want and destitution and the need to care for their daily life that they have no opportunities to live a public or a good life. I think she would accept, I think misery is what she would say is a kind of violence done to the individual. I mean, she doesn't put it in those words, but I think she would accept that. Poverty, she says, doesn't have to be misery insofar as you can be poor and still have dignity, have a job, work, take care of yourself, and do things. So I take, I don't know if you'll accept this, David, but if you say misery is apparent and there are miserable people, and I think you're absolutely right, there are, I think you and Hannah Arendt would agree that to the extent there are miserable people, and there are many in the United States for sure, who are so beset by need that they simply have almost no opportunity to live a meaningful public life. That's a failing of the government and of our system, and it needs to be addressed. How to address it, I think, is a different question. Whether a big centralized government in far away is the better way to deal with it, or more local institutions, is a question that I don't think you have to take an ideological point of view on. This is not, again, trying to be ideological. This is simply to say, from her point of view, if the goal is to actually empower people, to give them a sense that they matter. A better way to do that is to speak with them and engage with them as directly as one can. And that large bureaucratic institutions don't usually succeed in doing that very well. I take that to be her point. I'm not trying to be ideal. I don't think she's trying to say, she's not against a welfare state or for a welfare state. This is not the argument she's having. And I see why you're bringing it in that direction, but I don't see that as her argument. You can have a welfare state that is local, or you can have a welfare state that's larger. You can, if you feel like you need to tax nationally and then let people spend locally, you can do that too. I'm not trying to make that argument politically one way or the other.
Hey, Roger, Scott McLean here. How are you?
Good, Scott.
Hey, just on an example of how power being at a local level to me makes more sense, and I'll use an example that is often brought up recently is a national minimum wage. So regardless of whether I agree with a minimum wage or not, let's just say I do, kind of the solution is this $15 an hour minimum wage. $15 an hour in New York City or Manhattan's not going to get you anything. But there are rural places, 50 miles from where I am in Columbus, where $15 an hour, you'll be able to afford a 2,000 square foot house on 5 acres. And so it makes 0 cents to pay a 15-year-old $15 an hour working at a Tasty Freeze in the middle of Athens, Ohio. And he will make, and he can afford, if a 15-year-old can afford, you can buy a nice house on 5 acres for $50 or $60 or $1,000. I guess my point is that, if we want to do a minimum wage, to me, it might make more sense in Manhattan that the minimum wage is $25 an hour, whereas in the middle of Oklahoma, it's $9 an hour. I guess I'll just use that as an example of the locality.
Yeah. I see a question from Daphne about federalism that continues some of this. Daphne, do you want to frame your question or just let me read it online?
Well, just that we were talking about federalism, and I think that what we found in Hannah Arendt's other writings, where she talks about the fact that the public is important or it's one aspect of the human condition, and it allows people to participate in the political process. She uses federalism for solutions to especially my particular area of interest, which is Israel, where she suggested that. But I think that on violence, she talks a lot about Western states with established institutions, and that the resorting to violence is she's ambivalent about it. But my question is that in a lot of societies where people have absolutely no rights, and maybe she doesn't look at that because she's not looking at the third world, but in societies where violence is the only expression possible because they don't have institutions through which to work, and it's not a question of big or small bureaucracies. I wonder what she would say today, considering that you can read her mind. At least that's my hope. What would she, how would she address the fact that people who have absolutely no recourse to any other means of protest to extreme injustice, they have no institutions, what other means are there for them except violence? And I think that Tara gave me some bit of an answer about that in the next sentence, but maybe you could address that.
Yeah, so first of all, Arendt would never use the term third world, just to put that out there. She thinks it's an ideology. She thinks you have to look at each individual country.
Yeah, I did read that. I'm sorry. I remember that, yes.
But, as I've tried to say a number of times, Arendt is not a pacifist. And as she says many times in this essays, violence can be useful. And its primary use is to make, from what I take from her point of view, the primary use of violence, the most useful way it can work in politics, is to make injustices visible. And so, if you live in a country in which there is profound injustice, and there are no institutional ways that you can make your voice heard against that injustice, violence may be a meaningful and effective path. Her argument continues, though, that it is unlikely that violence will allow you to build a new system. It can help expose the injustices of a system, but it's not going to allow you to build something new. And so and the danger of using violence to even expose injustice is that if it's most likely that when you use violence, the state will use it back and you'll use it back, and you'll create a kind of cycle of violence that will end up not making anything better. And so, as Tara mentioned in her answer, Gandhi takes a different view, which is that there's another way to make injustice visible, not through violence, but through satyagaya, or a kind of non-violent resistance. And I just been teaching this book this week, Why Civil Resistance Works, by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, which argues that over the last 120 years, nonviolent revolutionary and political movements have been much more successful than violent ones since from 1900 to 2006, which is the time they study. I'm sure there's arguments against their study, and we can talk about them. But I don't think violence. I see the attractions of violence. Arendt sees the attractions of violence. I would never say it should be taken completely off the table. But I think Arendt's argument is that it's generally not going to work. And I think that this very interesting empirical study by Chenoweth and Stephan makes that case. Not that it never works; it sometimes does, but it generally doesn't. And I think it especially generally doesn't in those situations in which the violence is not seen as justified against an injustice.
If I can just chime in one thing about it's Tara again,
yeah.
about Gandhi, which I think can relate back to Arendt, is that I think one of the reasons that Gandhi, in addition to the spiritual and resisting the extremism at the time in India, it's also the fact that that people change, and that one may wield violence at one time for a certain ideological purpose and inflict harm, and then can evolve, and so that it's actually, even though we think of Gandhi as someone, or Martin Luther King as so kind of righteous and committed, nonviolence actually leaves room for your your thoughts and your purposes to evolve because you have not enacted harm in their name. So it allows for a different type of, I think, spontaneity in the future because you have not committed everything to this one path and done harm in its name.
I think that's right. It also opens the door to your opponents to join you in a way that often violence does not, or at least some of your opponents to join you.
Can I bring in a specific example? I don't know if that helps, but this is what I've been thinking of when I raised that question. You have Gaza in the Middle East, where you have millions of people living there without any access to human rights. And so every time that there is opposition, it's described as violence. Now, I don't know if that constitutes violence and if that's a totally unproductive way of protest, but what other means are there available to people cooped up in this prison for so many years?
I think the question of what is violence, this goes back to somewhat degrees David Bell's question about the violence of poverty. Is that a violence? But I mean, is blocking a road violence? Is tearing down a wall violence? Is blowing up an arms depot violence versus suicide bombings? And so we get into a definitional question of what you're going to conclude and call violence in these kind of situations. But there are many ways one can imagine making one's voice heard in a given society. And yet, as I think, Daphne just said, there are times maybe when violence is the only way to make your voice heard. I don't want to. I mean, we'd have to look at particular acts in Gaza and particular people and look at those. And I'm not gonna. I don't think we have the time to do that now. But there's no doubt that for Arendt, there are times when a very oppressed people has no other choice but to blow something up or kill someone in order to make the injustice that they want to bring to the popular attention visible. There's just no other way. Usually there is. I mean, at least, in a country like the United States or many other countries, there are other ways. But sometimes there's not. And again, there is no tout court rejection of violence in this essay. I don't want, I can only say it how many times. What there is saying, be very careful when you resort to it, because in all likelihood, it's not going to work. In all likelihood, what it's going to do is lead to more violence, not lead to the end of violence. That's, I take it to be her point. Are there questions about this or other? We can also go to other parts of the essay that are of interest, but I'm happy to do whatever you guys are interested in.
I wanted to go back to your point, which you emphasized very strongly in Arendt, the issue of the scientific elites and your belief, which I agree with, the antipathy that Trump has sort of tapped. And I'm thinking of a sort of a practical situation, particularly in the way that Governor Cuomo is sort of bridging the gap, if you will, or being a bridge between exhibiting the scientific facts, but weaving within that, I think, powerful anecdotal stories of real people, his brother, his own life, his own personal reaction, emotional, intellectual to it, sort of even touching upon spiritualism at times. And I'm just thinking, is there something in there as a way to nonviolently acknowledge but not get reduced to a kind of a scientific elitism, which I agree will and can turn people off and make them quite angry. Just any thoughts about that, how Cuomo is dealing with the situation which is here and present?
I think it's a good point, and I think it's a general claim of leadership. I mean, what Arendt is really after is a kind of turn to a bureaucrat. I don't want to keep using the word. I have Bob in my head because Bob said the bureaucrats are good too. So look at the current scenario, right? We need people like Dr. Fauci and these other, people who are part of the public health bureaucracy in the United States. They have been absolutely essential. There's no argument that they should not be involved. Even President Trump, who, God forbid, who almost kicked them out at the very beginning, has realized he needs to bring them in. What I think someone like Cuomo has done well, and maybe this is what you're saying, Frank, is that he listens to the experts, but he says, look, I'm in charge. I'm not an expert. I'm not a public health expert, but I'm the one in charge, and I'm going to make this based on a whole lot of calculations. What I talk to my brother about, what I talk to my daughters about, common sense, and try and bring a wider judgmental perspective than just public health expertise. And he says, look, we got to open it up. We got to get our economy working. We got to get people back into the, doing things. I understand that. I have cabin fever too. And so he strikes a more populist, common sense oriented tone. And I think that's the skill of a good leader, who's able to balance that. David? Yeah.
I heard Cuomo speaking. I too was very impressed with his balance and his what seemed to be real sincerity. But he also described a phone call that he made. And this is what sincerity is up against. He was trying to get, I can't remember now whether it was tests or protection gear for health and social care workers. He was having to bid on an open market. And he bid. He then had a phone call and said, Governor Cuomo, California's just outbid you. Can you raise your bid? And then he hung up and realized he was also bidding against the federal government at the same time. Now, what I think that sort of shocking but real moment draws attention to is that is the kind of world that we live in where that isn't a crime. Where it isn't a crime to put people's lives on how much are you prepared to pay.
So David,
and I can't believe that. That's a kind of evisceration.
Yeah, but let me ask you a question. The same thing is happening between France and Germany, or between, Canada and who knows what other state needs masks or ventilators. So one answer would be, well, look, this is ridiculous. Why should the United States be bidding against France? Or why should Canada be bidding against Germany? We should really have a world government who, buys all this stuff and procures all this stuff and distributes it where it's needed the most. I mean, that would be the logical implication of your point, if I understand it correctly. And
that was a vision of the WHO.
And that was the vision of the WHO, and it's a vision that Hannah Arendt found deeply dangerous. Largely because her worry is that just as any one country can become totalitarian or tyrannical, there's no reason that a world government couldn't be, and that if a world government became tyrannical, there'd be no place to escape, whereas If certain countries become tyrannical, there are other places to fight against them and to escape. This is like federalism writ large. But also, she's worried about this general inefficiency, but also de-actualization, Praxisenzug of large bureaucratic governments. So, I mean, I heard these. Trust me, I listened to Cuomo speaking too, and I heard those, and I found it awful and terrible that these countries were bidding against each other, and wished there was some way around it. But that wish for a kind of centralized WHO response, I mean, what happens when the WHO gets it wrong? Like, to be honest, they did in this case. WHO didn't act so well in this case. And one of the problems where a lot of people are having is that the guidance that we got from the WHO from the beginning was wrong. Is it good to have, I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages of both. I'm not trying to say decentralization is the best way to do it, but I also think we have to be wary of centralization. And I think Arendt points us in that direction as well. Obviously, I wish California, New York, Germany, France, Italy could have all gotten together and called the same people up together and said, look, we're not going to bid each other. But that's a kind of leadership problem that unfortunately no one rose to the challenge of. Even none of them did. They all became nationalists at time of crisis because that's who they politically represent. And I'm not sure what the way out of that is. I mean, maybe you have one, David. I don't have one.
On the subject of federalism, I just have one comment I wanted to make about it. The idea that federalism can be the source of freedom is, I suppose, is something you can work through, as she does. But the American experience has been quite the opposite. The American federal system, which was created in the Constitution, was designed to entrench the powers of the slave states and the institution of slavery. And it took the Civil War, in which the national government, previously much weaker, had to impose a regime of freedom on those states. And so it seems to me that's quite completely the opposite of the proposition that federalism is a source of freedom. And whether so I mean, I guess there's an answer to that, but it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be the tainted purpose for the original design of federalism, but it's certainly not the American experience.
Yeah, the federalism is not actually what she's interested in. It's more the federalist principle of the multiplication of power sources throughout society. When we've read On Revolution, we've talked much more about this, and I'm happy to point you towards it. But so it's not that she's defending particularly the federalist system in the United States. But she does think that the United States Constitution is inspired by a federalist principle that rejects the idea that there can be any one sovereign institution in a society, and that the way to protect against the accumulation of power is not by limiting power, but by actually expanding and multiplying the power sources throughout a society. But we can come back to that when we read On Revolution again. I haven't been able to keep up with all the comments in the chat, so I'm sorry. Are there other?
Roger, I wanted to raise a question. Arendt is talking, it seems, about organized violence, whether movements or governments, but it seems to me what we've been seeing here in the last 20 plus years is all these acts of individual violence, the school shootings and all these different things, which I think could easily be described as what she's saying about the frustration and whatnot that people are feeling and taking up arms. And I don't know, it feels like the kind of violence we're dealing with now is more this kind of individualized violence. I guess one exception is Charlottesville and what happened there.
No, I think that's a great point. And, she's talking about collective violence because that's what the theorists generally theorize, right? I mean, but, one of the failings of the anti-gun movement, right, is to not understand why people want guns. And again, I'm certainly on the side of the anti-gun movement. I'm just saying I don't think it's understood it. And part of it is, I think, what you were just saying, Susan, which is that for people who feel disempowered, having a gun is a feeling of empowerment. And you have to take that seriously. You can't just ignore it and poo-poo it. It's a meaningful desire for being significant and mattering and having a voice and a say in a society, even if you don't even want to do anything with it, right? Just owning it and having it makes you feel like you're taking a stand, that you're like going to protect yourself and your family or something along those lines. And I think it's important for people to understand that not all people who own guns are, whatever you want to call them, that there's a reason for it. And the kind of individual acts of violence often come out of, as you said, cries for being paid attention to or mattering or et cetera. And again, that doesn't justify them at all. It's simply trying to understand it so that you can make sense of it. There's a long comment by someone called User. I don't know who it is. What is DV? Even if DV fails to recognize nonviolent forms, DV, which set to control in Australia.
Domestic violence.
Is this you, David, who wrote this?
Okay. It's not me, no.
Even DV, domestic violence, fails to recognize the non-violent forms of domestic violence, which set to control in Australia. The system favors the men, and not all men are cavemen. However, in Australia, at least women have to name their alleged domestic violence partner, or they will not get any assistance. That is profound injustice. This defies the rule of law principles entirely. Then, as David Bell said, the violence of poverty fails to make a distinction that people who are controlled by domestic violence financially or those who put up and shut up may avoid direct physical violence. The hypocrisy, as Arendt explains, is wherein lies the rise of violence. Therefore, those who fall foul to dishonest accusations are deeply impacted by the affect. Without programs such as Innocence Project, people can be emotionally trapped. All it takes is an accusation and the police charge. Okay, that's a great comment. I'm not sure. I don't know who wrote it. If you're there, do you want to say something about it? Okay. We have about 5 or 10 minutes left if anyone wants to add anything or have a different kind of question.
Roger, I have a different kind of question.
Okay.
I think we're when we read this this piece, and in our discussions, we're talking about a certain kind of violence that we're very, very familiar with, which is a public display of violence, whether it's by individuals or groups. But what we're encountering now in today's times is people who express being victims of violence, usually verbal, which are hard to discern. In other words, you need to be the victim, or you need to be in very close conscious connection to the victim to understand how a microaggression is a microaggression, and why it is a microaggression, and is it a form of violence. So I know this is a complete change of subject, but when I think about violence in the present day, one of the ways in which I think about that is the ways in which speech has been imposed upon by these concepts of aggression in language. And I know that it plays out as in various ways in the academy, and also in the discourse of the right when they talk about being oppressed by liberal speech. But the whole idea of speech being violent, that is, to protect people from the violence of speech, is a question that I'm having a hard time comprehending.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a big question to open. So, a long time ago, I used to write about something called law's violence, sort of the violence of law, and we would distinguish between the violence of law that could be like, the death penalty or imprisonment, which is one kind of violence, and the violence that law commits in naming things as crimes. Being an illegal immigrant. Why do you call them illegal? And things of that sort. And that there's a linguistic violence to how you name things. And there's no, and I think that on the one hand, you have to understand the difference between the two, and on the other hand, there's obviously a connection. They both are a kind of imposition of my will on you in a way that doesn't, that doesn't allow you to respond in a way. And so, I think it is important to understand the ways that language can do harm. Language does matter. And yet, I think there's another way in which you understand that it's different. I mean, I guess, Jack, yes, I mean, when people say that microaggressions are a kind of violence, there's, what's your problem with that? On the one hand, obviously it's different from shooting somebody or hitting them. On the other hand, it can cause pain and suffering. So I think it's important to understand both the ways in which they're the similar and the ways in which they're different. I wouldn't know how to respond to it another way.
Roger, I think I could add something to that.
Okay.
What occurs to, I was saying this earlier in the comments, was that there's really kind of two definitions of action if you go back to human condition, which is, on the one side, there's telling a story, and on the other side, there is the blunt imposition of physical violence. And they're both intended to accomplish the same thing. And it's to appear, it's to actually be here with each other and to come to terms when we see something we don't agree with. And in that respect, they both have the intent of fostering change. And whether you're using judo or you're using rhetoric, they're both really organized to overcome opposition, to identify victims, to identify villains, to identify heroes. All that foundational narratological approach is to effect change. It's to call forward a question of what is not correct in our shared identity, to call forward a question of its meaning, and to suggest that we should change that. And when you're not heard, when you will not be heard, either because it's too big of a system or it's you are discriminated against, then you are only left with option B, which is out and out violence itself.
That was good.
Thanks, Jason. Anyone else want to comment on this topic? Well, we're at 2:30. I want to thank you all. This was another great discussion. I want to say we're going to start reading next week this book, Men in Dark Times. I think next week we'll still continue on blue jeans as we've been doing. There's been some thought that we have about switching to Zoom, which a lot of us have been using for teaching, and it seems like it might be a slightly better platform. Is there anyone who finds that problematic or has questions about it? Feel free to get in touch with me. We're not going to do it for next week. We'll still be on blue jeans. So we'll meet next week to discuss Men in Dark Times. And I very much look forward to seeing you all next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.
Roger,
Thank you, Roger.
Roger, I have a blue jeans question. Is there some way to save the chat box? Does anybody know if there is some way to save the chat box?
You know, I think you just have to. No, I don't think there is. I mean, you can copy each one particularly, but
it's tedious.
But it's somewhat tedious. Oh, by the way, we have set up, someone last week, was it Jason or someone suggested that we set up like a Slack group? And
What's that?
It's basically a place you can go and make comments and keep the conversation going and talk about what we're talking about. So we have set it up. We are going to send out an email letting you all know how to do that, and you'll be able to keep the conversation going. So that will be great.
Which essays, Roger, in Men in Dark Times?
We'll read the whole book, but for next week, we're going to read the preface, which is short, and then On Humanity in Dark Times, Thoughts About Lessing, which is a great essay.
Well, the whole schedule is on the website now, going through June 5th.
Right. We put the schedule up last night, so if you want to, you can look on the website and see the schedule. But we are reading the Lessing essay for next week.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Good seeing everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Roger. Great.
Bye, Roger.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Roger.
Good night. Thank you.
Good day.
Take care.